Welcome. How is it that most of what we seem to deem wonderful and ethical and open and just and empathetic and insightful and courageous is by most of those in positions of power today deemed quaint and antiquated and weak? How is it that quick, somewhat brutal flexing of muscle and banging of chest is viewed as the best way to approach complicated human issues? Why is it that a human life which focuses on, as its most formidable experience, a time when they played well with the ball, a barbell, stock options, and or a deadly weapon, is so highly regarded? Why so often are these life experiences presented and viewed as the best preparation for one to lead in this great union of states? Why are the socially minded, poetic, romantic, philosophically strong aspects of a human life deemed rudimentary and ill-conceived? Where are our great minds, our great and courageous souls, our open and strong hearts? Why don't we seek them out? Why don't we nurture them? Welcome again. My name is Lawrence Pugliese, and you're watching Stories, Wisdom, and Recipes. Today's guests are George Haskett, Professor of Social Work at Marywood University, and Doug Austin and Coleman Smith. Without further ado, the family Smith, a.k.a. Roots of Bluegrass.
1, 2, 3.
Beautiful. Beautiful. All right. Roots of Bluegrass. And these are all cousins, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen. The Smith boys. We'll be hearing some more from them in a little while. And at the table, as I mentioned, we have Professor George Haskett. And this gentleman is a neighbor of mine, and we designed this show just talking in front of our houses while he was going for a walk, stopping by to say hello. He told me about a lot of the time he spent researching one of our former presidents, Lyndon Baines Johnson. So today I'm going to introduce you to Professor Haskett, and we'll talk a little bit about his research. George?
All right, thank you.
Nice to see you. Are you having a good time so far?
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Great music.
Yeah, doesn't that loosen you
Yes.
up?
Yep.
And the licorice tea, is that acceptable?
Excellent.
Okay, good. What I like to do usually is give people a little background on the person who's going to share their perspective with us. So, if you would, sir, tell us where you were born and raised.
Was born in Norfolk, Virginia, and stayed in the Tidewater, Virginia area until I went into the service in 1960, and went to undergraduate school also in Tidewater, Virginia. Went to graduate school at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Stayed in Virginia until 1979 and moved to New York City to do my doctoral work at Columbia. And planned always to go back to Virginia, and happened to end up in Northeast Pennsylvania in 1985. Been here since then.
1985.
Yeah.
Because of the possibility of a job.
I was offered a teaching job at Marywood at the School of Social Work, and I had been teaching as an adjunct in New York. I taught at Fordham for 5 years. I taught at Columbia for a couple of years and taught at Hunter School of Social Work. But I had never planned to be a full-time teacher, and lo and behold, it turned out to be more interesting than I had ever thought.
20 years later.
Yeah, 20 years later.
Now, when you were a youngster in Virginia,
Mm-hmm.
what was it like? What was it like growing up? What was the neighborhood like? How do you recollect?
Well,
that time?
it was the South in the 1940s and the 1950s, and so this was before the Civil Rights era. In fact, it's before the television era. So it's quite a different world than today. And I think probably some of those early childhood experiences led me to a later interest in social work and certainly to Lyndon Johnson. But it was a very different world. If you can imagine water fountains for white people and water fountains for colored people, if you can imagine black people not being able to walk into a theater, if you can imagine very despicable, horrific lynchings and things like that. Most of that had dissipated by the 40s when I was born, but it was still, the vestiges of it were still there. So it was a different country, I think, then.
Than today.
Than today, absolutely.
So you remember vividly the segregation?
I remember the segregation very vividly, yeah. In fact, in the 1950s, when the Supreme Court decision, Brown versus the Board of Education, integrated the schools, a lot of the schools just didn't integrate. They just said no. I mean, you can pass a law, but you can't make people obey the law. And many of the schools did not start to integrate until the 1960s. And in fact, if you look today to schools across the country, there's still a lot of racial segregation, economic segregation in the schools.
Yeah. I tend to think sometimes it becomes almost an economic thing.
It is today, yeah. Schools follow taxes.
Yeah, exactly. Now, when you were a youngster, did you sit back and wonder why these different water fountains were in existence, different places for people to sit down and have something to eat?
Yes, I mean, there's always the Sunday school influence in the things you're taught in Sunday school and the religious principles, and then the reality. And if you're a reflective person and you hear one thing about humanity and equality and everybody should be treated the same, and you see something quite different, some people are going to pause and wonder about that and be concerned about it.
And usually children are the ones to open up their mouths and point to those contradictions.
Why is it that way, right? Yeah. I remember vividly my first trip to Chicago when I was 8 years old. This is 1950, and my aunt, who's a school teacher, telling me, now this is Chicago, and Chicago is different. So if a black person sits down beside you on the streetcar, don't say anything because Chicago is different. Chicago turned out to be not as different as she was telling me
Really?
years later, but it certainly was different from the South in 1950.
Now, being a Southerner,
Mm-hmm.
does that give you mixed emotions when you look at the history of that part of the country? At times, or do you think that's just the history of our
Yeah.
whole country?
Yes, mixed emotions. It's very difficult, I think, to sort of explain it, because there's been a lot of progress in race relations since the 1960s and 70s, and it's certainly a different world today. So it's not entirely a negative story, and so you can look back and see things, and you can see a lot of progress in American society too.
That stemmed from some of the challenges that came out of the South.
I think they stem from the challenges that came out of the South, and they stem from the Civil Rights Revolution and leaders like Martin Luther King, who worked, and King worked for, that's how I got interested in Johnson. King worked for 10 years without success, and along comes just a national crisis, and Johnson becomes president when Kennedy is assassinated, and Johnson decides to make civil rights his number one priority. And Johnson had been in Congress for 31 years before he became president. So here you have somebody in control of the executive branch who really knows how to move the legislative branch. And on top of that, you have a country that is in shock over a presidential assassination and is in a mood to do something a little more progressive.
So he came well equipped and at a time that he was needed.
Yes.
LBJ.
Yeah.
And you looked at his life. You had been looking at his life for a good number of time, a good amount of time now, and I'm wondering if you have any insight in terms of what his childhood was like, how he came up in this nation of ours, and how it influenced who he was as a political leader.
That's a fascinating story, and there are thousands of pages written about it, but it's a reminder of what life was like in many parts of the United States when he was born in 1908. He was born in the hill country of Texas, which is a part of Texas that it's hard to imagine, but it's about the size of all the states of New England plus the state of Pennsylvania, so it's huge, 250 miles east and west and north, and 250 miles north and south. And it wasn't electrified at that point. There was not electricity, and there wasn't running water. So he grew up in a very, he wasn't, he always talked about being poor. Politicians frequently do talk about pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. But he literally was poor, certainly in comparison with what happened to him over his lifespan. But everybody else was poor too. And he was a FDR fan, and he was a populist and a progressive, and I think he used the things that he had experienced and his sympathy for the lives of people to make life better for a lot of people in his congressional career, and then when he became president as well.
And you said he had about approximately 31 years in Congress, including his day
Yes.
as a staffer.
Yeah.
His year as a staffer.
He went to Washington as an undergraduate. As a recent graduate, undergraduate school. Was a congressional staffer for a man who didn't take much interest in the office. So Johnson, being an organizer at a very early age, was a take charge kind of person, and he ran that office. And in
how old was he, would you say? Must
he
have been
was
22?
he was 23 when he went to Washington, and then he through the Depression he continued to work in Washington, and then went back to Texas to become the director of the National Youth Administration, which was like a civilian conservation corps, is an effort in the Great Depression years to try to put people to work, not to give them a handout, but to give them a hand up, to get them into school and to put them to work. And he was, as a young man, he was made one of those NYA directors. And the congressman in the area died. He's 27 years old. And there were 8 or 9 people running for it. He had not a chance, people thought. There's no way that they're going to elect somebody that young to the congressional seat. He beat all 8 of them.
Wow.
Went into Congress as a 28-year-old.
Wow. Well, and then from that
And,
point on,
and stayed in Congress for the rest of his career until Kennedy picked him as his vice presidential candidate for the 1960 election.
and then we know what happened with the assassination. That was, by the way, great background. Thank you for sharing it. He became president. He had to finish the last year of Kennedy's term, and then he had his own 4 years. Now, you've mentioned that he worked on civil rights, his Great Society programs. Did he come in totally opposed to segregation? Did he have that mindset, or he must have had some?
It's a very complicated story, but I brought something. I want to read one short thing.
Please do, sir.
This is from 1963 when he was vice president, and he had been asked to go to Gettysburg to commemorate the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation on Memorial Day in 1963. And this is what he said on that day, and this is a short part of it. But until justice is blind to color, until education is unaware of race, until opportunity is unconcerned with the color of men's skin, emancipation will be a proclamation but not a fact. And from his standpoint in 1963, that was still the case. Emancipation was a proclamation, but it was not a fact for black Americans. So he goes on to say, to the extent that the proclamation of emancipation is not fulfilled, in fact, to that extent, we shall have fallen short of assuring freedom to the free. And later that year, when Kennedy was assassinated, he became president, and that's where he started. That's what he started with. That's to make that a fact, to pass a Civil Rights Act, and it was one of the first pieces of legislation in 1964, and he pushed it. I mean, he could push legislation like no one before and no one since. He could get things done. The thing that's most fascinating about him to me is that there's so many presidents that make so many speeches and they sound great, but a lot of things just, they're just words on a page or words before a group. But he actually worked things through that Congress and got them done.
It wasn't empty rhetoric.
It was not. Yeah.
Now, I know you mentioned that President Johnson was a big fan of FDR.
Right.
And do we have a photograph here of?
Yeah, I think you have a photograph there that you can put up, and it's a picture of.
Can you do that, Mark? Please?
And it's a picture of FDR in Galveston, Texas, with the governor of Texas, and with the young Congressman Lyndon Johnson, and it's a good illustration of what Johnson looked like when he was a young man, and it's a good illustration of how sometimes people you think couldn't possibly be connected, but the 1930s and the 1960s are connected in the case of those two politicians.
FDR
and LBJ.
Influenced.
Yeah. He was
LBJ in a significant manner.
He was a great admirer, Johnson was, of FDR. I learned a lot from him about how to get things done.
Wow, that's fascinating. Good photograph. I saw it earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And I know we were talking earlier about the Johnson, what was it called? Maybe we could talk about the second half.
The Johnson treatment.
The Johnson treatment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to get into that. I have so many questions here for you. I sort of paused and put the photograph up there. Were you going somewhere that I
No, that's just, it's a good picture and a good illustration that Johnson, I think, is largely forgotten now. He's probably remembered more for Vietnam than anything else. But people, I would say, young people, and by that I mean people under 50, probably don't remember Johnson. And he wasn't well known before he became president, and he certainly didn't have the same charismatic appearance that JFK had.
He wasn't a good-looking guy.
He wasn't
JFK.
a good-looking, Harvard-educated, rich Northeasterner.
They didn't get along really much, did they?
they got along
Oh, they
well.
did?
JFK and Johnson got along. In fact, Kennedy's father had originally wanted Johnson to run for the presidency back in 1956 and had invited him. Kennedy was a fairly neophyte politician when Johnson had been in Congress for 25 years. They got along well, but Johnson didn't get along well with Bobby Kennedy.
So
that was
JFK
the real conflict.
So the Attorney General
Yeah,
and LBJ did not get along.
yeah.
He retained him, though, didn't he? Or am
He
I-
did retain him. And then Kennedy asked to be considered on the 64 ticket as the vice president, and he refused to put him on the ticket, asked Hubert Humphrey instead. And they had a falling out. And it's interesting because some of the more current scholarship, particularly in the civil rights era, the civil rights area, I should say, shows Johnson as being a much more pro-civil rights person than, ironically, Kennedy was, who had that reputation but wasn't quite so sure that he wanted to spend his political capital on it. He just didn't-
We're talking John or Robert?
We're talking about both of them, actually.
Both of them.
Yeah,
So he was more. Lyndon was more.
yeah, because
of an advocate.
because Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, was the Attorney General still, and he was for a time suggesting that Johnson go slow on civil rights. The country might not be ready for it.
Well, I guess you have to think about your political career. I guess I don't know, and it's to me definitely a bold set of steps that Johnson took in his presidency. Bold set of steps.
Yeah.
And
And that's just one thing. I mean, that's probably, ironically, it's not what he's known for, civil rights. He's probably more known for the Economic Opportunity Act, Medicare, Medicaid, the Older Americans Act. He's known for being the greatest producer of social legislation in the 20th century, even greater than FDR to a certain extent.
Thus the name of the Great Society,
Yeah,
right?
Great Society, right.
Do you think many folks, many of our fellow citizens in the African American segment of society know where Johnson stands in the history books as per how he helped them?
My sense of it is that people who have read the histories of the civil rights era know that the black community was much more optimistic about Johnson because he sent clear messages that this is something he wanted to do. And he and he and Martin Luther King and others in the civil rights movement worked very closely together, giving each other advice about how to make this happen. So I think the current scholarship suggests that people will remember Johnson as very pro-civil rights. It was a surprise because if you looked at him before 1960, it would have been a different story. If you looked at all the things he did up to the time when he became president.
Because
he was from the South, because the Congress was essentially in control of being controlled by Southern politicians, and because it wasn't the political, pragmatic thing to do, and because you could argue perhaps the country wasn't ready for it. You can read poll after poll of that time of white citizens, and they were recommending that be patient a little longer. But you have to remember that this is encouraging people to be patient who've been waiting since the 17th century, since 1650.
Right, and it wasn't like there was a huge block of African American voters you can count on,
Well, they-
because the Jim Crow laws
They
kept them from the
absolutely
polls.
couldn't vote
Right.
in parts of Mississippi, and that's Johnson not only was responsible for the Civil Rights Act of '64, which is a major piece of legislation, but the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which took some of those southern states and enfranchised blacks for the first time and allowed them to vote. They had been just systematically kept from exercising that right.
Some would argue that it still happens today, but we won't get into that. before we go to our first break, I want us to kind of segue down. You've given us a great sense of LBJ from his younger days, how he ended up in Washington and what he did as a congressman, why he might have done what he did, and then how he became president and what he did in that reign, span of time. Now, why I want to ask you, do you think LBJ is a compelling figure at present in today's world? Why do you think he would be a compelling figure? I think he's a compelling figure in today's world.
For me, it's that the current scholarship, people writing about that time, have in part gotten over the Vietnam issue, and they're writing less about that, and they're taking a longer look at civil rights as a revolution in American society, and seeing that as perhaps the most important part of his legacy. While in the 60s and the late 60s and 70s, it was the Vietnam War that was the most important thing.
Do you think, I think, and I'm wondering if you might agree, that given some of the challenges we face today, some dire situations in my view at least, and I think a lot of folks would agree with me, almost compels you to reflect on former leaders to see what we might learn from their challenges, what we might learn from their leadership. Do you think we can learn anything from President Johnson to help us understand better what we might do next today, given all the social challenges we face, whether it be a war in Iraq or the disparity between the poor and the wealthy growing greater and greater and things of that nature?
Well, absolutely, there's a lot to learn, but it's a counterpoint to any president that came after him. Johnson was a very different kind of president, and it's also a counterpoint to the capacity to enact legislation, because there's been no one since him who was as good at it as that, at getting what he wanted, and vision. And probably it's a counterpoint to how societies look at wars in the midst of them versus 10, 20, 30 years later. Now, we're not in a war now, so to speak, although we have a war president who calls himself a war president, and the conflict in Iraq is a good example of the same kind of conflict in American society that Vietnam was in the 1960s.
Right, before it really blew up.
Yeah.
I read a statistical comparison a while back. In the first 5 years, I think it was, of Vietnam conflict, as compared to the Iraq conflict, there were less casualties in Vietnam as compared to what we have had so far in the first few years of Iraq. So
yeah, it depends on when you're counting them, because the total of them was far greater.
Oh, yes.
in Vietnam. But we had advisors in Vietnam even before we declared war. We had advisors in the early '60s over there trying to help Vietnamese fight their own battle.
that's true. I guess it does depend exactly when it was officially decided we call it a conflict, and we were just advising. I'll have to look that up. See, you're a good mind. Thank you. I had a little gap there in my reasoning, and you pointed it out. Thank you, sir. By the way, folks, I forgot you were here. We're talking to Professor George Haskett, and we're focusing on Lyndon Baines Johnson on Stories, Wisdom, and Recipes. My name is Lawrence Pugliese. We're going to take a break from the dialogue at the table. I have more questions for the good professor. Right now, we want to share with you some good bluegrass music. This is called, let's see, the Tennessee Waltz, Doug whispers in my ear. And performing it for you, the Family Smith, a.k.a. Roots of Bluegrass. Enjoy. Waltz by the Roots of Bluegrass. All these gentlemen are cousins, the Smith boys, right? Doug, and we have Coleman, and we have Austin.
Yeah, I've been called worse.
Yeah. Starting with an S?
Yeah, I can't say.
Yeah, my kids are out there watching. Well, I want to give you guys, first of all, my deepest respect for coming on the show. I think you're a great compliment to the discussion.
We like being here, as always.
Thank you. And I want to give you an opportunity to share some information about upcoming gigs, whatever it is you want to share.
We got, yeah, certainly. Coming up this weekend, this Sunday, July 17th, our band, The Roots of Bluegrass, we're kind of down and dwindled in numbers right now. We got a couple more guys playing. We'll have some banjos and guitars and mandolins with us. We'll be playing at the Bethany Library. It's up near Honesdale, Pennsylvania. I think starting around 6 o'clock in the evening for an outdoor evening concert, little bluegrass. And then the first weekend in August, we'll be appearing down at Wingate, PA. There's a great bluegrass festival down there. First weekend in August. So there's a couple places you can come hear us, as well as some later dates around the area. I also want to mention, if you happen to have the opportunity, the weekend after next, the 23rd, it's a Saturday, we'll both be playing some Irish music down at the Banshee right in downtown Scranton. So come by the Banshee tomorrow. It's Saturday the 23rd.
Excellent. And Mr. Smith, the guru of this trio. I know you and I are working on a jazz festival coming up the 6th and 7th of August with Marco Marcinko and Bob Schlesinger and Laura Cadden-Foley and Dr. Luzzi. Anything else?
Well, actually, Larry, yeah, just as long as we mention that, I know we're going to be doing a show on it a little bit later, but just to give people a heads up.
Hanlon's Grove, right?
Hanlon's Grove, that really nice venue, which is taking shape even more now. We were just down there for a meeting the other day, and Bob and the city have been doing a good job on it. But there's really, truly internationally known jazz artists going to be there, and some local guys, some very talented local people. So we're going to have this schedule all over. It'll be in the paper, and I know we're going to do a show on it a little bit later on. But just so you reinforce the dates.
6th and 7th of August, Hanlon's Grove.
And it's only $10 a day.
And you
to
get
see
6 or
these.
7 acts a day.
Yeah, it's really quite a bargain.
Starting at 2 and ending at around 9 or so. Now, LBJ, did you like him?
This gentleman?
No, did you like Lyndon
Oh, did I
Johnson?
like, well, that was a time when let's see, that would be, I guess I was in high school, actually, probably around that point in time. So, to be honest with you, at that point in time, I wasn't really politically aware of a lot of things.
You were playing
know.
Frisbee and chasing...
I was actually shooting rockets off.
That's right, you're an electrical engineer. Yeah, that's right, I forgot.
But, I mean, I was obviously aware, see, what year would that have been now?
63, he became president.
Yeah, so I graduated high school in '64. So we were probably studying it, of course, in political science and things like that. And I was very aware of the civil rights part of it, which that did hit home, even in the little town where we were.
Newfoundland.
Yeah, I really did respect that part of his. I think that's one of the strongest things that he accomplished, and I was very aware of that at that point in time.
Awesome. Well, thanks for sharing your insight and your music, and we'll get back to you in about 15 minutes.
Okay, thanks, Larry.
Thank you, Doug, Coleman, and Austin.
I, by the way, was not aware of Lyndon Johnson in 1963.
You weren't
And
aware of him?
I was in the military service, and he was the vice president, and he was not somebody I was very much aware of. And even when I studied legislation from the 1960s, I wasn't fully aware of how important he was in it. So I think it's a good example that people probably looked at him, and there's another vice president, and
While he was actually
while he was actually vice president, and to a certain extent, even when he was president, he didn't have the same kind of image that Kennedy had. So inside the Beltway, inside Washington, they knew what he was like and what he could do. And by the way, your musical guests are a good complement to this, because one thing that people don't know about Johnson is he loved to dance. And he was probably one of the best ballroom dancers that was ever in the White House.
So the
if you can
Tennessee
imagine
Waltz.
it. Yeah, Tennessee Waltz.
Would have really hit him nicely.
He would have loved it.
Oh, excellent. Excellent. I try to design the music with the content. It's good to hear that it works. Yeah. All right, let's get back to our discussion, Professor Haskett. Now, do you want at this point in time to show that other picture that depicts...
Yeah, you can show that picture, and I think if people can see it, It's a picture of, it's actually three pictures showing Johnson talking to a congressman who is older than him and giving him what's called the Johnson treatment.
The Johnson
The
treatment.
Johnson treatment, which is, it's either he's grabbing you by the lapel, or he's got his arm around you, or he's got his finger in your face, or he's looking up your nostrils. Literally,
He'd be doing this to a senator
he
or
would
a
be doing it to
representative
a senator
from the
and
House?
to a representative, to anybody. In fact, Robert Caro, who is one of the best-known biographers of Johnson, even though most of his work has only taken Johnson through the Senate years, so he hasn't gotten to the presidential years, but he wrote one piece about Johnson in the civil rights era that described him as he gave that magnificent voting rights speech in the Congress and stepped off the podium and walked down and cornered Congressman Emanuel Seller and grabbed him by the lapels and said, "Manny, you're going to get working on this right away. You're going to start hearings tonight." Manny says, but Mr. President, I can't. Manny, I said, start hearings tonight. Well, they started the next day. And it moved through the Congress relatively quickly.
So the Johnson treatment, it worked.
It worked.
Now,
It worked.
did we see that photograph? Did we? Excellent. I'm gonna have to. I don't recall seeing those pictures before the show. I'll have to take a look at them. I have seen probably these pictures, and he looks very. He was a large man.
He's 6'3". Sometimes his weight would get up to 220, 230. And he had an intimidating presence. He was...
A strong nose
Yeah.
that he'd probably
Yeah.
be afraid to put in someone's face.
Right.
We don't have to get into this if you don't want to, but I've heard telltale that he would do strange things to reporters when they wanted to interview him.
Yes.
He would invite them
He
into
was
the...
rather coarse.
Yes.
Yes.
He'd invite
Into the bathroom.
Into the bathroom while
Yes.
he was doing his business.
Yes, absolutely.
And that, you think, was a psychological tactic he
Yeah.
used?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know what Bismarck said about politics is like making sausage. The more you know about it, the less you like it. The more you know what goes into the making of it, the less you might like it. Well, there's there are a lot of inside stories about Johnson that are not entirely positive, but it was for effect. I mean,
Right,
He did that to control people.
It wasn't as if he just was an uncivilized man, not realizing what he was doing. He was doing this for effect.
He knew what he was doing. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get to another question that I think will take us down the path of understanding LBJ a little bit better. What do you think was his most significant contribution to the evolution of our country?
But there's so many things. I think you could tick off just numerous pieces of legislation. I would start with the war on poverty, and you have to imagine what it was like in the country in the 1960s, when more than one third of all Americans who were over 65 were poor.
Wow.
Social Security was just
33%.
getting started. 35%, more than 1 in 3.
More than 1 in 3.
55% of African Americans were poor in 1963.
All ages, the whole.
All ages, the entire population, and if you segment the population, 50% of families that had one parent, female-headed families, were poor. And if you look at those statistics 4 or 5 years later, not just today, but 4 or 5 years later, after Johnson, it's a completely different story. Those poverty rates came down about 1/2 in a short period of time. And there are parts of that legislation that people, I think, still today don't understand, but it wasn't programs that got people out of poverty. It was economic growth. It was the management of the economy. It was the increase of the minimum wage. If you had a minimum wage today, like the minimum wage in 1967 and 1968, it would be something in the neighborhood of $7.50 to $8 an hour. And after Johnson left office, it started to slide again. But he grew the economy, so to speak. People got jobs.
So, excuse me 1 second. You're saying the minimum wage today is lower, adjusted for?
Yeah, you can earn the minimum wage today, working full-time, full year, And if you're a three-person family, you're going to be poor.
Right, but back in Johnson's era, that wouldn't be the case.
Back in Johnson's era, before he became president, that would be the case. But the period from 65, 66, 67, when he increased the minimum wage, a person working full-time, full year, would, with a three-person family, one earner, they'd be out of poverty.
Okay. I just want to make sure of that.
Yeah. So war and poverty was a big part of it. I think for people who are older, certainly people over 65, or people who've had difficulty getting health care, they would appreciate perhaps Medicare and Medicaid, because they fundamentally changed the delivery of health services in the country. And I worked in social welfare in that period, so I know how difficult it was for people who might have needed hospitalization but couldn't afford it, might have needed health care but couldn't afford it. And in 1965, he passed both Medicare and Medicaid against the resistance of the American Medical Association and the entire medical establishment. And this is something you could go back to FDR period, you can go back to Truman. Both of them tried to get some kind of national health insurance through the Congress and couldn't do it.
Because of the AMA.
AMA was probably the most important group at that time. It's much more diverse today, but because of the resistance to government paying for something that some people could afford,
Right.
and you still have today. If you think about it this way, if you still have about 15% of the population, about 45 million people who have difficulty affording health care, and this is 40 years later, and imagine what it would be like if you didn't have Medicare, which covers more than 40 million people, and Medicaid, which covers more than 40 million people, some of them the same people. It would be a greater problem.
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
No doubt.
So there's that legislation. I could go on.
It depends on which segment of society you're talking about. He or what sorts of challenges that our nation faces. It seems regularly. That's what we have to keep in mind, is that Johnson was a very dynamic sort of leader. He didn't just have one situation that he tackled: poverty, health care, a war in a foreign land,
Environmental
civil
protection,
rights,
clean water.
clean water. So you're saying he had a great effect on the evolution of this country.
Very great, very great. More than most people recognize.
Do you think in time people will recognize that? How do you think
Well,
history will treat him?
Some of the most recent things about profiles in presidential courage, a new book by Chris Wallace treats him very responsibly. A new book by Nick Kotz about the laws that changed America, civil rights, all of which treat him very positively. So I think he's getting a new look.
Good, good. I want to ask you one more question, Professor Haskett. And again, thank you for being on the program today. You've shared a lot of valuable insight and information. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
No, my pleasure. My pleasure. And now I want to ask you a question that is totally subjective, I would have to say. Given your experience as a social worker and student of human history, as we all are, if we open our eyes, what concerns you most at present, and what gives you hope at present?
I guess what concerns me most at present is there's various ways to talk about it, but terrorism around the world, bombings, war, and religious conflict in the context of that. It's not entirely religious conflict, but to a certain extent it gets presented as that, which I think is unfortunate. But domestically, I'm still concerned about people who don't have health care. I'm still concerned about people who are poor. People are still poor in the United States today, in Scranton, Pennsylvania, throughout the country. People still get victimized on a regular basis. We have pretty good child welfare legislation that's developed in the ensuing years, but you don't have as good a adult protection legislation, so you have senior citizens very vulnerably being abused. I could go on and on about things that would concern me, but it's a glass half filled. There's a lot of progress, and there's still a lot of things to do. I wish we had somebody like Johnson, somebody who wanted to do it.
So do I, sir.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for being on the
All
program.
right, thank you, Larry.
Oh, pleasure. It pays to talk to your neighbors. This is a prime example. We met just walking in our neighborhood and put this show together. Professor Haskett here on Stories, Wisdom, and Recipes. And in a moment, we're going to go back to the roots of bluegrass. Before that, my diatribe. Let's see what I have here today. What did I come up with? Well, first of all, next time we'll be having a bit of a garden party. We'll be taping outdoor. Brian Craig has dubbed this particular show that's coming up our OK Patio Show. Our guests will be OK Patty, Senor Sam Stavala, Jack Evans, Bob Schlesinger, Lori Cadden Foley, and I'm sure there'll be a couple other folks that we didn't bank on who will be great guests to have. It should be a spirited good time, so make sure you tune in for that. All right. Save Tree Stadium. What a poignant turn of phrase. Isn't it funny how quaint we often, as individuals, dub those aspects of life that we once waded in as beautiful, secure, home, and true, dub those same places and notions weak, immature, unrealistic, passé, not conducive to growth potential, economically ill-advised, and so on, and so on. We lose ourselves as we bow down to the dynamically challenged rationale of a faceless, sometimes heartless entity which often speaks out of both sides of its lipless, sometimes forked, corporate growth-driven, bottom-line manipulating, greed-infused mouth. Am I being too passionate, too analytical, too idealistic, unjustly critical? Maybe I just don't get it. Maybe I should speak in simple, empty, rhetorical phrases and bob and dodge any sentiment outside of a realm more controlled and banal. I think not, though. We see cures for all sorts of ailments these days. What about a cure for that which feeds on our sense of community? A cure for that which suppresses individual gleanings of growth beyond economic do-or-die hyperbole? Save Tree Stadium. What a strong, poignant, and poetic turn of phrase. Are we a strong, poignant, poetic community? So there you have it. Another episode of Stories, Wisdom, and Recipes. Until next time, remember your stories, wisdom, and recipes. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, the family Smith with another bluegrass piece for you called Southern Flavor.